Today we're going to talk about section 2.1, which is properties and operations. And when we talk about properties, what we're talking about is things we see and know to be true, but we can't really prove. So we're looking at some properties of numbers that by experience we have seen to be true. And these properties will help us to be able to do some certain things as we're solving equations and simplifying expressions. So we're going to go over those properties today. The first one is the commutative property of addition. Um, Basically, the root word of commutative is commute. Commute is something you do every day. You commute, or at least during the weekdays, you commute from home to school. You move from one place to another. So the commutative, if you look at commutative property of addition, if you have two numbers added together, I can simply move or change the order of those numbers and I get the same answer. Well, that seems pretty logical, but that actually has a name and it's called commutative property of addition. Commutative property of multiplication, same concept. I just changed the order. One's moving from the first position to the second position. One's commuting from the second position to the first. You can change the order and you still get the same answer. We do not have a commutative property of subtraction. You know, that changes. If you change the order, you change the answer. Also of division. You can't do that either. And there's one called the associative property of addition and multiplication. Well, associative speaks of associations or groupings. That's something you experience in junior high, elementary, high school. You're kind of in certain groupings or certain associations. Well, the associative property of addition states that if you have three numbers added together, and you can add the first two and then the last number. You can change that grouping and add the last two and then add the first number. You get the same answer. Okay. Also with multiplication, I can group the first two numbers together, then multiply the last number. I'm going to get the exact same answer if I change that grouping or that association and do the last two numbers first and then multiply the first number. So that's associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. There is not one for subtraction and there is not one for division. Okay, moving on. Let's see what we got here on the next page. Describe any rules and properties used in the following. So let's look at this. Now, if we see three numbers added together, what do we need to do first? Well, we move from left to right. And so we're going to do the first two. We're going to add those together first. Well, what tells us we can do that? Well, the order of operations. And I'll just do it like this. Order of operation, may need another color to stick out a little bit. Order of operations tells us that we need to do the first two, first. But I can change the grouping, and remember the property that deals with changing grouping is associative. That's associations. So that's associative property, and since we're doing addition, of addition. Now what did I do here in this next step? Well, I changed the order inside the grouping. Changing the order, I'm commuting. The number's commuting from here to here. So that is the commutative, and I'm just going to abbreviate property. And of course, it's of addition because that's what we're doing. And then I change the grouping back to the first two. Okay, again, when I change groupings, that's talking about associations or associative property of addition. And then the last thing I do is simply add 20 and 36, and I get 56. Okay, now why did I do all that work? Well, again, it's just to help us to see some things we can do with numbers. But I kind of like adding, if I'm doing mental math, I like adding 13 and 17 together better than I like adding 17 and 36 together. So I changed the order so I could add 17 and 13 in my head, and then add 36. Okay? And I actually, while I'm looking at this, I did that wrong. I should have checked over my work. 17 plus 13 is not 20. And I'm hoping you already saw that. That is 30 plus 36, and that is equal to 66. That's what happens when you do things quickly. Okay, looking at this next one, I've got multiplication. So what does order of operations tell us to do? It tells us to do the first two first. So that's order of operations. Well, I changed the grouping from the first two to the next two. So if I'm changing grouping, that is associative property of multiplication. Okay. Now, within that grouping, I changed the order. Well, the order speaks of commutative. I'm moving or commuting from one place to another. So that is of multiplication. Change the grouping again. That's associative of multiplication. Now I just simply multiply after I do the parentheses, I multiply the two numbers together, and I think this is correct. That is simply multiplication. Again, why did I do that? Because, I think it's easier to multiply 5 times 8 than -3 than to multiply 8 times -3 times 5 if you're doing it mentally. Obviously, if you're, and that's not too difficult, but sometimes you get harder numbers that you have to multiply together. And it's a lot easier to do 2 of them together, and then the next one. And sometimes you have to change the order up to do that. Let's look at the next page. Okay, use properties to simplify the expression. Now here simplifying means I can't get an answer because I don't know what x is. But I can simplify it, meaning I can put it in simpler terms than what it is. Now, if I knew what x was, simplifying means I need to get an answer, but I don't know what x is. Okay, but I know here I can actually add those two together. Okay, now order of operations tells me to do these two, but I know I'm not going to show all the steps, but I can change grouping. So that becomes x plus 14, and that is simplified. X plus 14. Let's look at this one. Well, I don't know what x is. I can't add 4 to x because x is a variable. And -1, I can't really add that to x either. But I can sure add 4 and -1 together. And when I do that, I get 3. And that's actually x plus 3. Now, x plus 3 and 3 plus x are the same thing, but we want to get in the habit of putting the variable first. And this is called a constant, meaning it's always the same. Variables vary, constants are the same. So we're going to put the constant last, the variable first, get in that habit. Okay, here, instead of multiplying 3 and k together, I want to multiply 6 and 3 together. It gives me 18k. Okay, I'm just multiplying the things that are alike. I've got two constants, two numbers. I can multiply them. I can't do anything with k. I don't know what it is. Here, I'm going to multiply the two numbers together. 2 times -5, -10, r. Okay, and again, we can do this because of the property of numbers that we saw in the section. That's what allows us to simplify like we're doing. Next, okay, the identity property, we want to introduce that. It's pretty obvious what this is, but the identity property of multiplication, if you have a number, you multiply it by 1, you get that same number. It keeps its identity. It doesn't change identity. So you start out with a 4, you end up with 4. That's what the identity property is all about. What you start out with, you end up with. It keeps its identity. The identity property of addition, meaning you're going to add 0 to a number so that it keeps its identity. So 4 plus 0 is 4. So that is the identity property of addition. I start out with a number, I end up with the same number. Okay, with multiplication, I multiply by 1. With addition, I add 0. Okay, so let's identify the properties. Let's look at this list we have down here. -5 times 1 equals -5. Well, which property is that? Well, I started out with -5. I end up with the -5. It kept its identity. That's the identity property of multiplication. Here, I changed the order. Well, commuting. Numbers commuted. So that's the commutative property of addition. Let's look at the next one. I start out with a 9, I end up with a 9. That's identity. It keeps its identity of addition. Okay, these are all properties. I'm trying to write fast. Here, I change the grouping. I start out with these two groups, then I'm changing the association. So that's the associative property. And I should have shorthanded that one, of multiplication. Here, again, I just changed the order. There's no groupings. So that's commutative because it's commuting. And then there is this one. Well, I've got 3 numbers, and I basically just changed the grouping. So that's associative. I changed the associations. Associative property of addition. Okay, let's look at the next page. Conversion factors. Now these are important because when we get to physics, which won't happen until 11th grade, you're going to be using a lot of conversion factors to convert one unit of measurement to another. A conversion factor converts a given measurement to different units. So let's look at the first problem. Use a conversion factor to convert 400 centimeters to meters. Well, I want to start out here with 400 centimeters, and I want to end up with meters. To do that, remember factor, what a factor is. So we're multiplying by here, and it's converting, so it's called a conversion factor. Well, if I'm ending up with meters, and somehow I'm losing centimeters, so it has to cancel. So what we got is, to cancel centimeters, remember we have to think of this as over 1. Okay, so if I'm canceling centimeters, I have a centimeters on top and a centimeters on bottom. So that cancels centimeters out, and meters will go on top. Well, 1 meter equals how many centimeters? 1 meter equals 100 centimeters. Now I simply multiply. 400 times 1 is 400. 1 times 100 is 100. 400 divided by 100 is 4. That gives me 4 meters. Let's do another conversion factor. 250 yards, and I'm going to feet. Okay, so I'm going to multiply by a factor, and it's a fraction, and I'm going to end up with feet here. I'm getting rid of yards, so remember this is over 1, so I need yards to be on the bottom, so it cancels out. If I've got a yards on top and yards on the bottom, that cancels. But I'm going to feet, so feet needs to be on top. Whatever you're going to is on top, whatever you're coming from is on bottom. The bigger unit is yards, so 1 yard, the bigger unit always gets a 1 beside it. Then how many of the smaller ones go into the bigger one? Well, 3. Okay, now I simply multiply. 3 times 250, well, that's 750. 750 feet. The bottom is just 1 times 1, so it would be over 1. We don't have to put that, so it's just 750 feet. Okay, again, this is a conversion factor. That's what we're wanting to see on these. These are conversion factors. What I'm multiplying by to change the units. Let's do one more of these and we'll be finished for today. 420 seconds. And we're going to minutes. We're going to multiply by one of these things. It's always a fraction, so always just put my fraction bar there. There's an equal sign. Okay, what I'm wanting to get rid of goes on the bottom. What I'm wanting to go to goes on top. The larger unit is minutes, so the larger unit always gets a 1 beside it. The bottom unit, I figured out how many of these go in that, and that's 60. Well, doing that, I'm starting out with 420 seconds. Okay, I'm going to minutes. So I multiply the tops together, I get 420, I don't have enough room here, over 60. Then I can just reduce this. 60 goes into 420. Well, it's the same as 6 going into 42. 6 times 7 is 42, so that equals 7 minutes. And that is using conversion factors to go from one unit of measure to the other. And that will conclude what we're doing today. Thanks for joining me.